Hey everyone, in today's video I would like to talk about grief. I would like to share my own personal story, and I would love to invite you to share your story. You can share it in the comments if that's something you feel comfortable with. You can share it in your own video, but I think it's really important that as a society we learn to talk about these things, and we learn to listen, we learn to stand around each other, and we learn to be there for each other, because often as outsiders we might think that grief is something that is temporary, and we can ask people, hey, aren't you done mourning this person yet? And reality teaches us that often we're not done, and grief can come in waves. I recently saw this really powerful animation about grief, explaining that it was like this ball, like a ball of yarn, and it was all messy and tangled up and kind of dark, and it was like this, and this would be your entire life. So if this was your life, the ball yarn would be like inside it, filling all of it. But then as time passes, the life around the grief expands. But sometimes, some days, we can still feel so overwhelmed in like special moments like birthdays or graduation, or maybe when you have a child and one of your parents isn't there anymore to celebrate with you. Then that grief can grow again, and it will expand, and it will feel like it fills all of your life again, and it will probably shrink again, because over time we learn how to deal with it. We learn how to live without this person in our life. But the grief is still there, it's still real, and it deserves to be spoken about. So in this video I want to share my story, the story of how I lost my mum to cancer about 6 years ago now. And I hope that by opening up about this topic, I'll invite others to do the same, and I hope that I'll be able to create a bit more of a safe space where grief becomes a topic that we can actually talk about. And yeah, I hope that we'll all learn to listen and to support each other. I was 18 at the time, and I literally just had a massive fight with my mum. I had moved out of my parents' house on quite short notice, actually. I used to fight with my mum a lot. She had a lot of pain in her back, and she was being really, really grumpy a lot of the time, and on top of that she was already a bit controlling. So we would fight a lot, and I would ask her to allow me to be a bit more independent, but she wasn't really able to provide that for me. So in the end, I decided to temporarily go live with a friend till I would find my own space to live. I studied at university at the time, and I was looking for a place in the city that I studied in. But for the time being, since the situation at home got quite tense, I decided to move out of my parents' house, to move in with a friend from my church. And about 2 weeks after I moved out, I got a phone call from my mum. I was out shopping with a friend. I hadn't spoken to my mum in like 2 weeks, and I got this phone call, and mum was like, you better sit down. So we sat down, and I listened as my mum called me from the hospital, and she said, it's wrong, it's not good, they've found cancer and it's not looking good. And in that moment I had no idea what to do or how to feel. And it was just all so crazy because I hadn't spoken to my mum in like 2 weeks, and then I was talking to her on the phone and she was telling me that they found cancer and they didn't know if they could treat it yet, but I had to come home. So that is what I did. And a friend that I went shopping with came home with me. I was really scared to go home, to be honest, so I went to my best friend's house on my way home, and we stopped by their house and we went in, and I sat down on their sofa and they prayed for me, and I cried my eyes out because I was really, really terrified of what I was gonna see and find at home and what I was gonna hear from my mum. Then I got home and my mum explained what the doctors had found. The very next day, all of us, so me, my mum, my dad and my grandma, went to the hospital, and they showed us these pictures, and the doctor said that every dark grey spot on the pictures was cancer, and that every dark grey spot in the picture didn't belong there. And I looked at the picture and I was kind of like, but the entire picture is dark grey. This can't be true. But the doctor made no mistake. My mum had cancer in her lungs, in her liver and in her spine, and that also explained why she'd had this pain in her back for so long. The pain that had made her really grumpy, and from that day on, the local hospital decided that it was actually too difficult for them to treat this patient, and they moved her to a university hospital, and she would go in for treatment. I would still continue to live with my friend, but I would go home every once in a while. At the start it was just like every few days, and then I think it was like 3 or 4 times a week, to show my mum that I still really, really cared and that I still loved her, even though I had kind of run away from home. And that was just the weirdest period, because she could not understand why I left home. She felt like it was a criticism on her as a mother. She felt like it was me saying, "You're a terrible mum, therefore I'm going to leave home," and she didn't understand that it was part of that natural process where you grow older and you grow more independent of your parents. So basically, till the end, we had misunderstandings about this, so we stopped talking about it. We just stopped talking about it. And I think it was really great for me that I had this safe space to go back to after visiting my parents, because my parents had never had a good relationship, and during the time that my mum was ill, my dad really, really stepped up, and he was like, "I've promised you, when we got married, I made my vows and I've made promises to you, and I will keep those." And I think it was the first time in years that one of them at least tried to work on their marriage. And my dad did an incredible job trying to be there for my mum, trying to do the laundry and chores and everything. And my mum would just sit there and complain at him. It was absolutely heartbreaking, because he would try and it would never be good enough. But yeah, we went on like that for a few months, and my dad took me aside and told me that from everything he heard from the doctors, he thought it was most likely that my mum would pass away that year. And when I talked to my grandma, when I talked to my mum, they would not want to admit how bad the situation really was. My mum had chemotherapy, my mum had radiation therapy, and all they could really do was prolong her life. There was no chance she would ever get better, but my mum and my gran were not really ready to accept that. So they kind of pretended everything would be alright again someday. It was on a Monday evening that my mum got new medication. A Monday evening, July 2014, my mum got new medication, and she was being really foggy, and she would ask for a glass of water, and then I would walk to the tap in the next room, and then I'd shout to her like, "Hey mum, do you want like cold water or hot water?" Because her stomach could be really sensitive when she was on all this medication. And then she would not even remember having asked for water. So that was like a very surreal experience, and that was also the moment that we realized that we were so close to losing her, because she wasn't really my mum anymore. She was just like an empty shell of a person. And there were so many things I still wanted to talk to her about, and there were like recipes that I wanted to ask her about, but she was being so foggy that there was no point. And that evening I went home and I thought, you know what, maybe she'll feel better tomorrow, maybe she'll be used to the new medication by then. And I went home and I got there early the next day because I wanted to go say hi to my mum before I would go out and have a nice little picnic with one of my friends. And the moment I opened the front door, I could hear my mum's breathing. She was upstairs in her bedroom, but the moment I opened the front door I could hear her, and it was this sound that I'll never forget. And I got in. My mum wasn't awake at that point, and she hadn't been awake that morning. She didn't wake up all day. She was very far gone. And I remember texting that friend to cancel the picnic, and texting my best friend at the time, and texting my cousin, who was also really close to my mum, telling them that it was probably my mum's last day. And my best friend came over. My grandma was already there, and some other lady who helped out with some chores in the house and who was mostly there to support my grandma. And we literally sat there waiting for my mum to die because we knew the end was coming. We'd called our GP. She came over and she was like, "I'm just gonna give him more medication to help her deal with the pain," but it's kind of end the story. And we called my dad, who left for work that morning, and he came home early, but he came home about 15 minutes too late because my mum had already passed away. And I looked at my mum and I was like, this is not my mum, this is like a wax doll. It was like someone had just like pushed her nose, like squeezed it tight like that, and it hadn't opened back up. It was this very surreal experience of seeing this body that used to belong to someone you loved, this body that you used to run to hide and to find comfort. And my mum was the best hugger in the world. She'd become so frail because of the cancer treatments, and she'd become so thin as well. She was always a bit chubby, like in a good and beautiful way, and now she had all this like loose skin around her, and she'd lost so much weight, and she didn't look like herself anymore at all. And it was such a surreal experience seeing her there and kind of feeling like it could not be real. Like there was no way that person that poorly made wax doll figure in my mum's bed was actually my mum. And from that moment on, you would kind of expect things to get better, I guess, because, you go through grieving and then things get better, but they really, really didn't. We wanted a funeral, but it was the middle of summer. My mum died at the end of July, and literally all the pastors in our local area were on holiday. And we had quite a tough time finding a pastor to actually do the ceremony and the service. And then me and my gran fought over what the pastor was going to have to talk about, because my gran comes from a very strict church, and she was basically, long story short, she thinks everyone's going to go to hell. So usually funerals in that kind of church are a little depressing, where I felt like that would not do justice to the happy, bubbly person that my mum was, and I felt like that was not what my mum would have wanted. So we had to fight about that, and we in the end found this lovely pastor who did a wonderful job making it all a very hopeful service and a celebration of the afterlife. And that was such a thing that I found comfort in, because with all the pain that my mum went through when she had cancer, and all the pain that she'd been through in the years before when she was stuck in this terrible marriage, that was partly terrible because of her own actions and choices, but I think we were all kind of stuck in that situation. And in that way, my mum dying felt like a liberation, which sounds horrible, but it's true, at least for me, and I think it's the same for my dad. It was kind of a relief, because we were all freed of this marriage, this pretend happy family that we had to be part of for so long. But as time went by, people stopped asking me how I was doing. People stopped expecting me to be still sad about it. And that's the weird part, because it's been 6 years now, and there are days where I'm still really, really sad about it. And it's usually those big moments where you have your graduation and your mum isn't there to cheer you on, or when you meet this great new guy and you just want to introduce him to your mum, but there's no other way than taking him to a graveyard or telling him 5 million stories about who your mum was and hoping you can do it justice. And it's your friends getting married and your mum not being able to be there, and you realizing that whenever you get married, your mum's not going to be there. And sometimes it hits you like a rock in the face, like it hits you real hard, and there's nothing you want to do but cry. Sometimes there's the small moments where you've forgotten how your mum made spaghetti, or how you remember how you always used to go to the zoo together, and now every time I go to my favourite zoo, she's there with me, just for a little bit. And when friends tell me the stories and the memories they have, it's good. It's good to hear those stories, and it's good to keep her memory alive. And usually when I talk about my mum, which comes up in conversation quite often, because I was quite young when I moved into a house on my own, and people were like, hey, how can you afford to live in a house like this? And I'd be like, well, my mum died, so I got an inheritance, and now I can live in this fancy nice house. But my mum's also dead, so it's not great, But it's this entire massive mess of weird feelings where I feel grateful that I have space to grow at my own pace, in my own direction, because my mum's not there to put her expectations on me. But at the same time, I miss her because I would want her to be there in all the big moments and the small moments. And sometimes it hits me really hard. Like when I talk about it for a while, you can hear it, you can tell from my voice that this hurts. That this is a raw part of me that still hurts and still bleeds a little sometimes. And recently I was translating for this woman in church. One of my favorite pastors is from the States, and she lived in my country for a while, and she did some preaching in my church, and she's this lovely, warm woman, and she preached about her brother who recently passed away. And as she stood there and she was really brave, and she stood there talking about her loss that was so raw and fresh. And I stood there next to her translating, and I think she talked about loss, but she also talked about hope and heaven. And as she spoke, her voice broke, and as I stood next to her translating, exactly the same happened to me. Because these emotions, loss, grief you feel, even if it's been years since you've lost someone, feelings are still raw and painful sometimes. And you know, most days I'm perfectly fine. I've talked to a therapist because the grief I was experiencing was extremely complex, with my mum having all these expectations and my mum basically being really, really attached to me, and then my mum suddenly not being there anymore. So I've talked to therapists about it. I've talked to friends, but I noticed that my friends stopped talking about it after a while, and sometimes new friends can be really, really careful, and they're like, oh, do you not want me to talk about my parents? But people, please, talk about your parents, complain about them, celebrate them, talk about them, because they're real, they're there. They may not be perfect, because no one is, but whether they're still there or whether they've left us, they're part of our lives and they've shaped us, and we would not do ourselves justice if we would ignore that part of our being. And I think it's good to just be honest about it. Like I'm honest about how I miss my mum, but how I also feel like I couldn't be the person I am today if she was still here. So yeah, that's my story. This is how I lost my mum to cancer. And I hope that by me being vulnerable and honest, you also feel like there is a space for your grief, like there is a space for you to be vulnerable, and that you have every right to talk about someone that you love who you've lost. And you have every right to seek help if you need to. If you just want to have a brief chat about it with me, feel free to leave a comment below or to reach out to me, because I felt really, really alone back in the day, because no one my age, none of my friends knew what I was going through. They'd maybe lost like a cat or a rabbit, but no one had lost anyone close to them. And it's horrible to feel like you're all alone, because you already feel so abandoned. And I don't want you to feel that way. I want you to know that your feelings are valid and you're not alone, that you are loved, and that I really, really care about you, and that I hope that you have the support around you that you need. I want to leave it at this for now, but please feel free to share your story and to find comfort in knowing that you are not alone. Thank you for watching.